Today's story, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, is a classic locked room mystery and one of the most popular of the Holmes stories. And of course, we focus on the bizarre details of the phony bell pull, the ventilator that doesn't ventilate, and the snake that drinks milk and responds to whistles. So it's easy to lose sight of the motive behind this convoluted murder plot, the Stoner girls' inheritances. As part of Holmes's thorough investigation, he dug up the details of Dr. Roylott's stepdaughter's inheritance. Each girl, if she married, would take with her an income of £250 per year, money that would no longer go to Roylott, leaving him in very straitened circumstances. So it was to Roylott's advantage to see that the girls died before they could be married. Since he had a violent nature, a complete absence of conscience, and ready access to dangerous tropical animals, of course, Roylott came up with the elaborate, improbable, and utterly fiendish plot that has entertained Sherlockians for so many years. The loss of a few £100s of inherited money might seem like a feeble justification for putting such a labor-intensive, not to mention evil, plan into motion. But to a Victorian, it might not seem so strange. Victorians were fascinated by wills, bequests, entails, trusts, probate, and all the legal and personal ramifications of inheritances. This was true even though it was unusual to have enough assets to even make a will necessary. In 1850, only about 15% of adults who died had enough left behind to make a will worthwhile. This number gradually increased, but not by a whole lot. Of course, the fact that wills were far from universal, one might even say exotic, may have made them even more interesting. It also helped that Britain, unlike most of the rest of Europe, didn't generally require estates to be passed on to spouses and children, although there was a strong cultural preference for doing so. People could and did leave money to their servants, their cats, their alcoholic cousins, and anyone else they fancied. Newspapers and magazines regularly featured stories of these strange bequests. Inheritance law, which was somewhat archaic and chaotic at the beginning of the 19th century, was gradually reformed through new statutes in 1837 and 1857, along with the establishment of the Central Probate Registry and changes to inheritance taxes. Wills were never far from the Victorian mind. The theme of wills and inheritance showed up repeatedly in Victorian novels, many of which were wildly popular at the time, and some of which are still widely read today. In the romantic classic Jane Eyre, published in 1847, the poor beleaguered heroine's life is suddenly and drastically changed by an unexpected and enormous bequest from her uncle. The entire plot of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, serialized in 1852 to 53, hinges on the exhausting, many years-long attempt to legally untangle two or more conflicting wills. And Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, published in 1860, is still considered one of the greatest mystery novels in the English language. Its astonishing series of events is initiated by a nobleman who needs to keep his status as an illegitimate son a secret, lest it make it impossible for him to inherit an estate that is entailed on legitimate offspring. We'll see echoes of that later on in the Holmes canon. With all of this fascination with inheritances, it's not surprising that Conan Doyle jumped on the bandwagon. The Speckled Band is one of the most grotesque of the inheritance-related stories, with a venomous snake slithering about at the behest of a psychopathic stepfather. But the prospect of loss of the use of an inheritance due to a daughter or stepdaughter marrying drives some very strange behavior in several of the other stories as well. If you were an unmarried young lady in Victorian England, a bequest from a dead relative could be, shall we say, a mixed blessing. As a properly brought up young woman, you were of course living with your parents and allowing them the use of whatever income your benefactor had left you. If you were to marry and leave the household, your inheritance would go with you. And even though the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave you some control over your inheritance and assets, in the cultural climate of the time, your husband would still no doubt take over the management of your finances. As we saw with Dr. Roylott, not all parents or step-parents were willing to let that happen without a fight. In The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, Alice Rucastle's repulsive father was not quite ready to commit murder to keep her at home, but his efforts almost had that effect anyway. According to the housekeeper, Mrs. Toller, Alice was content to let her father and stepmother have the use of her inheritance until, to quote Mrs. Toller, there was a chance of a husband coming forward who would ask for all that the law would give him. After he worried his daughter into brain fever trying to force her to sign a paper turning her assets over to him, Rucastle still had to keep her fiancé away by imprisoning her and convincing him that she had given him up. Hence the strange demands made on Miss Violet Hunter, the new governess: the short haircut, the blue dress, the exactly positioned chair. Happily for Alice, her young man was able to rescue her from her imprisonment and Miss Hunter from her bizarre employment. In the process, Mr. Rucastle got his comeuppance at the hands, or rather the jaws, of his guard dog. Yet another convoluted scheme gone horribly awry. A case of identity brings us a less life-threatening, but even more improbable attempt to keep a daughter and her money at home. Mary Sutherland didn't even have a fiancé in the offing, but her stepfather was determined to make sure she never would. With the aid of Mary's mother and of Mary's own nearsightedness and remarkable degree of gullibility, he posed as a suitor, got engaged to her, extracted a promise of eternal faithfulness no matter what happened, and then disappeared on the way to the church on their wedding day. And even though Holmes managed to unravel this plot, he decided to keep poor Mary in the dark about it. Although her life was never in danger, she certainly got a raw deal. In addition to turning on issues of inheritance, both of these stories illustrate some incredibly bad parenting. Although step-parents were involved in each, they could not have carried off their dastardly deeds without the willing connivance of the girl's natural parents. We can only hope that this was not typical of Victorian standards of parenthood. Of course, not all of the villains trying to get their hands on a young lady's inheritance were related to her. In The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, Miss Violet Smith, yes, another Violet, an impoverished music teacher, took a too-good-to-be-true offer of employment in a remote country estate. Her employer, Mr. Carruthers, explained the extravagant salary by telling her that he knew her uncle in South Africa. Though the uncle was penniless, he asked Carruthers to look after his niece's welfare. Other than the advances of her employer's friend, the odious Mr. Woodley, her situation seemed ideal, until she noticed a pursuer on her weekly bicycle trips to the train station. After the usual Holmesian round of investigations, including some fisticuffs, Holmes uncovered that Woodley and Carruthers knew that Miss Smith's uncle was in fact wealthy, and since he had never made a will, his fortune would pass on his death to his nearest relative, Violet. They returned to England, playing cards on the way to decide which of them would woo and marry her and share Smith's fortune with the other. Apparently, they were not aware of the Married Women's Property Acts. Fortunately, Holmes and Watson, after a high-speed chase through country lanes, were just in time to rescue Violet from abduction and a forced marriage to Woodley. Although she had a harrowing experience, perhaps she could at least take comfort in the fact that her own parents were not behind it. So far, we've been following the travails of young ladies who are set upon, whether by relatives or others, for the sake of various sums of money, from trivial to substantial. But it wasn't just damsels who could be distressed, and the stakes could be substantially higher than a mere monetary bequest. In The Hound of the Baskervilles, an entire country estate with mansion, furnishings, land, title, and servants provides a huge motive for a hugely complex effort by a remote relative of the estate's owner to murder everyone who stands between him and the inheritance. If you've ever seen the movie Kind Hearts and Coronets, you get the general idea. Instead of a snake, a la Speckled Band, Stapleton, the remote relative in disguise, uses an old family legend of a spectral hound to prime his victims for death. With the help of a huge dog and some glowing phosphorus, he manages to terrify the estate's current owner into a fatal heart attack. The next heir, Sir Henry, is younger and of sterner stuff, but Stapleton and his dog still nearly do him in before Holmes and Watson arrive in the nick of time to rescue him and put an end to the poor dog, who was just doing his job. One of the many interesting twists in this story is inheritance of a different kind. Holmes finds the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place when he notices that Stapleton is the exact image of the portrait of old Sir Hugo Baskerville, the dastardly character who started the whole hound legend 200 years before. The realization that Stapleton is descended from Sir Hugo lets him understand what Stapleton is really trying to do and why. Holmes calls the resemblance an interesting instance of a throwback which appears to be both physical and spiritual. We moderns would call it genetic inheritance. Although Victorians had a fair amount of latitude in leaving bequests, they did have some rules to contend with. Entailment involved legally binding restrictions on the sale or division of inherited property. The point of an entail was to ensure that property was kept together and kept in the family, generally by requiring that it be passed along to the oldest legitimate son. This could create some hard feelings on the part of younger or illegitimate offspring. In The Adventure of the Priory School, the Duke of Holderness has two sons, the older illegitimate, the younger legitimate, and thus due to inherit the dukedom and all that goes with it. The elder son, James Wilder, is understandably unhappy about losing out on his father's property through no fault of his own. In fact, through the fault of his father. He kidnaps young Lord Saltire, the legitimate heir, from his boarding school in an attempt to blackmail Lord Holderness into breaking the entail on the property and allowing Wilder to inherit it. Would Lord Holderness have been able to do so even if he wanted to? I don't know. It would probably take a Charles Dickens lawyer many years to pursue this question through the court system. This story has some interesting elements in common with Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, in which another illegitimate son must go to ridiculous lengths to cover up his status and inherit an estate that is entailed on legitimate offspring. In the absence of an entailment, the freedom of most Victorians to leave their property to anyone they pleased drives the adventure of the Norwood builder. Old Jonas Oldacre, the builder of the title, summons young solicitor John Hector McFarlane to draw up a will leaving his property to McFarlane himself. McFarlane had never even met Oldacre, but had vaguely heard of him as an old acquaintance of his parents. Though surprised, he knows a good thing when he sees it, or thinks he does, and agrees to come to Oldacre's house in Norwood and draw up the will. Imagine his horror when, on the train back to London, he reads that Oldacre has been murdered and that he, McFarlane, is the prime suspect. Of course, he goes straight to Sherlock Holmes for help. After plenty of twists and turns, including setting a fire in a corridor of Oldacre's house, Holmes uncovers the truth. Oldacre has never forgiven McFarlane's mother for breaking their engagement and marrying another man. By drawing up the will to look like a motive for murder and then faking his own death, he hopes that McFarlane will be convicted and hanged, thus finally exacting revenge on McFarlane's mother for spurning him so many years ago. The corridor fire set by Holmes serves to smoke Oldacre out of his hiding place and into the arms of the police. In this case, it turns out revenge is a dish served hot rather than cold. Sometimes a will didn't even have to exist to figure prominently in a crime. Fake wills show up in one of the earliest and also in one of the last stories in the canon. In The Red-Headed League, a bank robber uses the strange provision of a completely imaginary will to lure pawnbroker Jabez Wilson out of his shop. Supposedly, an eccentric red-haired American left his fortune to establish the Red-Headed League to provide remuneration to similarly coiffed Londoners. Thus, the flamingly red-haired Wilson spends hours in the League's offices being paid handsomely to copy the encyclopedia. When this sweet gig suddenly vanishes, Wilson hires Holmes to find out what happened. Holmes discovers that the whole rigmarole was simply meant to keep Wilson out of his pawn shop while the robber digs a tunnel to a neighboring bank to steal a shipment of gold from its vaults. Of course, Holmes foils the plan, but poor Wilson never gets to finish copying the encyclopedia. The Adventure of the Three Garridebs also involves an imaginary will by an eccentric American. The Victorians must have seen America as a seething cauldron of wealthy eccentrics just dying to leave their fortunes to unsuspecting Englishmen. In this case, our non-existent American is named Alexander Hamilton Garrideb, and he has left his non-existent fortune to the first 3 adult male Garadebs who can be found to claim it. When Nathan Garadeb, a mild-mannered old collector of oddities in London, gets a visit from John Garadeb, supposedly a Kansas lawyer, he's all in on finding a 3rd Garadeb and hires Holmes to help. Intrigued by the peculiarities of the case, Holmes does his usual sleuthing. The upshot is that Alexander Hamilton Garadeb never existed, John Garadeb is really an American criminal named Killer Evans, and poor Nathan is the only genuine Garadeb in the bunch. Evans concocted the whole scheme just to lure the stay-at-home Nathan out of his house long enough to pry up his floorboards and get to the counterfeiting equipment left by the previous tenant, the man who Evans shot back in America. Apparently, in the Victorian mind, America was populated not just by wealthy eccentrics, but also by ruthless and extremely creative criminals. I could come up with even more examples of inheritance-related crimes, both in Conan Doyle's writings and in Victorian literature in general. But this sampling serves to show that while inheritances could be a source of both great wealth and great danger for a few lucky or unlucky Britishers, they were a source of terrific entertainment for the whole reading public. And luckily for us, they remain so in the 21st century.